Step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. These are his words. Let's begin. The more defeats we suffered, the more difficult it became to maintain the line of the Elbe, especially to continue making Dresden the centre of operations. As previously mentioned, Austria's declaration of war jeopardized this line by allowing the enemy to bypass it through Bohemia. Over the past month, our successive defeats and the ever-growing number of enemy forces made the adoption of a new strategy essential. Yet Napoleon could not consent to abandoning the Elbe. By maintaining his position at the centre of Germany, he reassured the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine and simultaneously threatened Berlin, Silesia, and Bohemia. A single victory could push him back toward the Oder and dissolve the coalition. He conceived the idea of shifting the centre of his operations to Torgau and manoeuvring on both banks of the Elbe, from Berlin to Bohemia and from the Oder to Westphalia. The Torgau position was indeed more central. To the right lay Wittenberg and Magdeburg, while to the left, Meissen and Dresden provided supporting points. While Napoleon developed and prepared to execute this plan, he remained personally in Dresden, closely monitoring the operations of the Army of Silesia and the Army of Bohemia, ready at all times either to exploit the enemy's mistakes or to rectify those of his lieutenants. The 1st and 14th Corps remained guarding the mountain passes of Bohemia. The 2nd Division of the 1st Corps held the advanced position at Nollendorf. The 1st Division was stationed at Peterswald, and the 23rd at Hellendorf. On the morning of the 14th, the enemy's vanguard took the offensive. Colloredo attacked the 14th Corps via the Breitenau Road, and Wittgenstein assaulted the 1st Corps along the Peterswald route. The Dumonceau Division retreated hastily to Peterswald, while the 1st Division, alerted somewhat late, took up arms in its turn. As previously noted, this division now consisted of only 7 battalions instead of 14. General Philippon deployed them in battle formation ahead of Peterswald. He failed to form a reserve or send out skirmishers, seemingly leaving the outcome of the day to chance. This result came swiftly. Scarcely had the 2nd Division passed Peterswald when the soldiers of the 1st, seeing the enemy approach along the main road and manoeuvring columns threatening their right flank, succumbed to a panic. They rushed headlong into Peterswald, whose outermost houses were already occupied by enemy skirmishers. Officers and even generals were swept away in the rout. Fortunately, the enemy, lacking cavalry, pursued only weakly. We rallied halfway to Hellendorf, along the edge of the woods skirting the road, under the cover of the 23rd Division. Casualties were relatively light, and proportionally, more officers than soldiers were lost. The 17th Regiment had 3 officers killed and 3 wounded. The 36th lost 2 officers. In such unfortunate circumstances, it falls to the officers to set an example, and they are always the last to withdraw. I offered few reproaches to the soldiers, seeking to avoid further degrading them in their own eyes. Stripping them of self-esteem would have completed their ruin. Count Lobau, who never left us for a moment, appeared calm. His expression alone betrayed the dissatisfaction and frustration caused by the disarray. General Philippon bore the brunt of the blame, as the events would show. Barely had we rallied and formed into battle formation along the woods of Hellendorf when a surgeon major emerged, dragging a conscript by the collar who was crying out loudly and struggling. He brought him to me, asserting that he had seen the soldier mutilate himself. Indeed, the soldier had a finger blown off and a hand blackened with powder. The surgeon major implored me to have him shot. Fortunately, the man was not from my brigade, so I merely drove him away in disgrace. Others might have acted differently, believing that, after the recent events, an example was necessary. I admit that if anything can justify an arbitrary execution, it is such cowardice in the face of the enemy. A soldier who mutilates himself to avoid a glorious death deserves to die an ignoble one. That evening, The entire corps of the army took up position on the heights of Gießhübel. The 14th Corps also fell back to Liebstadt. On the 15th, Napoleon left Dresden with the Guard and arrived at Gießhübel, immediately resuming the offensive. He did not intend to invade Bohemia, but aimed to push the enemy beyond the mountains, force them to deploy their entire army, and ascertain their strength and position. The 1st Corps, serving as the vanguard of the Imperial Guard, advanced along the Peterswalder road. The 42nd Division supported them to the left, via Bara, while the remainder of the 14th Corps moved to the right through Fürstenwald. The enemy retreated, and we camped at Hellendorf. The following morning, just as we were about to set out, General Philippon received a letter from the Major General announcing his retirement. This severity surprised both officers and soldiers, and it may have been excessive. His only fault was a lack of intelligence, which hardly warranted ending his career and stripping him of command on the eve of battle. General Cassagnier arrived at the same time to replace him. The advance continued, with the enemy taking position on the Kulm plain while we camped on the heights of Nollendorf. On the 17th, the 23rd Division held its position at Nollendorf. The other divisions of the 1st Corps descended into the plain, led by General Ornano's cavalry and always supported on the left by the 42nd Division. Napoleon, stationed on the heights of Nollendorf, observed and directed this movement. As my brigade passed near him, he called me over to deliver an inconsequential order. This gesture merely signified that he knew I was present and thought of me, a customary practice when he wished to show favour to an officer. I have not seen the Emperor since. I cherish this last memory with interest and gratitude. In the plain, the cavalry and the 42nd Division engaged in combat while the 1st and 2nd Divisions remained in reserve. The engagement was spirited but inconclusive. The cavalry captured an Austrian battery, which was soon recaptured. The 42nd Division seized the village of Arbeso, but Austrian General Colloredo drove them out and captured 1,000 men of the Young Guard, including General Kreutzer, who commanded them. The 42nd Division fell back to Telnitz, where the 1st Division joined them, having traversed nearly impassable dense woods. Marshal Gouvion Saint-Cyr, arriving somewhat late, aligned with our position. General Teste, descending from Nollendorf that evening, stopped at Kneenitz. The following day, on the 18th, the enemy attacked General Teste. The 1st Division positioned itself to his right. The attack was repelled, and we held our position. This was the last offensive maneuver that the Emperor conducted against Schwarzenberg. He lacked sufficient forces to penetrate Bohemia, which would have taken him too far from the centre of operations. However, he was determined to firmly secure the mountain passes and prevent the enemy from approaching Dresden so easily again. "My intention," he wrote, "is that Borna and Gießhübel be held firmly, so I have no concern for these two positions. The enemy must not be able to dislodge us without a general movement of their army, which would then justify my response against them. But they must not force such a response from me with simple light divisions, as has just occurred." Accordingly, the 1st Corps was assigned to guard the Peterswald route, while the 14th Corps watched over Fürstenwald. On the 19th, the 1st Corps took up position at Gießhübel, leaving the 23rd Division as the vanguard at Hellendorf. The Emperor himself issued the most precise and detailed instructions for the retreat, rightly emphasizing that no backward movements should be made during the day. The 1st Corps maintained this position until October 7th. This minor campaign lasted less than 15 days, which was significant given the soldiers' state of exhaustion. The greatest difficulty arose from the lack of provisions. Napoleon devoted as much care as possible to this issue. Large stores of flour had been amassed in Torgau, and several convoys were sent to Dresden. On September 18th, the Emperor wrote to Marshal Gouvion Saint-Cyr to inform him of these arrangements. He aimed to provide a daily ration of 4 ounces of rice and 16 ounces of bread. Yet distributions were infrequent and highly irregular, one of the primary causes of the physical and moral decline among our soldiers. During the expedition I just described, the weather was almost consistently poor, and the roads were impassable. The sight of the locations where we had suffered so many setbacks deeply affected the soldiers' spirits. We should only have revisited the Peterswalder Road and the Kulm Plain to claim a resounding revenge. Instead, everything consisted of marches and countermarches, and after a doubtful skirmish, we withdrew to resume our positions. The soldiers, who were not privy to Napoleon's strategic manoeuvres, concluded that the army of Bohemia was invincible and that we were reduced to a defensive stance before it. Disorganization progressed so rapidly that an order of the day prescribed decimating soldiers who deserted their flags. Isolated men were to be apprehended, and upon gathering 10 such individuals, generals were instructed to draw lots and execute one in the presence of the division. The same punishment was ordered for anyone cowardly enough to mutilate themselves. These harsh orders were undoubtedly intended as deterrents, but they were indicative of the moral weakening within our troops. We tried, at least, to make use of the period of rest afforded to us at the Gishubal camp. Decent barracks were built to shelter the soldiers. Some food distributions were made, and we exploited the scarce resources available in nearby villages. However, nothing could prevent the soldiers from consuming anything they could find, resulting in over 80 men of the 12th being poisoned after eating the fruit of a shrub known as Rhamnus alternus. General Cassagne, our new divisional commander, displayed zeal, affable manners, and an easygoing character. I could not assess his military capabilities, since we had done very little since his appointment, but I was pleased with my interactions with him. He particularly oversaw the 1st Brigade, which had been somewhat neglected following General Pouchelon's departure. As for me, I was continually focused on my brigade. Colonel Susbiel of the 17th supported me effectively. I was relatively satisfied with the battalion commanders, especially Mr. Locqueneux, newly promoted. The junior officers of both regiments did their best, often setting good examples for the soldiers, though these were poorly followed. On September 29th, the 1st Division replaced the 23rd at Hollendorf to serve as the vanguard alongside the light cavalry. This duty was arduous, requiring constant vigilance, which was as necessary as it was challenging to achieve. Nevertheless, through persistent effort, the duties of sentries, patrols, and reconnaissance were performed as well as possible. The greatest difficulty remained preventing soldiers from leaving camp to forage for provisions in the surrounding areas, often risking capture by enemy patrols. We were not attacked, and remained in this position until October 7th, as I will discuss after addressing the operations of the other corps of the Grande Armée. After forcing the army of Bohemia away from Dresden, Napoleon aimed to also push back the army of Silesia. Marshal MacDonald was at Hartau and Stolpen, nearly encircled by Blücher, who occupied Burke, Bischofwerder, Neustadt, and Barkersdorf. MacDonald was ordered to attack on the 22nd and drive the enemy until they were found in position, ready to receive battle. While the Emperor initially stayed back, he joined MacDonald on the 22nd to personally oversee the manoeuvre. From experience, he knew things rarely went well in his absence. The attack occurred, and Blücher retreated to the position of Burke, where he concentrated his army. This location was advantageous, with a secure retreat provided by the bridges of the Spree. Thus, the coalition army avoided undertaking any serious initiatives before the arrival of General Benningsen. They merely sought to avoid being significantly engaged and confined themselves to harassing us and causing as much harm as possible in minor skirmishes. At the end of September, the positions of the belligerent armies were as follows. The 1st and 14th Corps guarded the Dresden area on the left bank of the Elbe near Pirna. The 2nd Corps, at Freiburg, monitored the Chemnitz road. The 3rd, 5th and 11th Corps, along with the 2nd and 4th Cavalry, on the right bank of the Elbe, opposed the army of Silesia near Weissig. The King of Naples, with the 6th Corps and 1st Cavalry, stationed at Meissen and Grossenhain, maintained communication with Torgau and monitored the Elbe's course to that point. Marshal Ney, on the left bank at Dessau, observed the movements of the Army of the North positioned across the river. Prince Poniatowski, with the 8th Corps and General Lefebvre Desnouettes' light cavalry, was at Altenburg, linking with the 2nd Corps and 3rd Cavalry at Leipzig. The Duke of Castiglione, having left Würzburg with his newly organized corps, approached Jena. As for the coalition forces, the Army of Bohemia occupied the Kulm Plain, with its left wing extending toward Chemnitz. The Army of Silesia, positioned at Bautzen, connected with the Army of Bohemia through Stolpen and with the Army of the North via Elsterwerda. The Army of the North held the banks of the Elster from Herzberg to the Elbe's confluence, besieged Wittenberg, and then extended along the Elbe to the Saale confluence. The coalition forces were in this position when General Benningsen arrived at Leutmeritz on September 26th, joining the Army of Bohemia. At this point, the Allied offensive movement was decided. The Army of Bohemia, advancing on its left flank, was to move toward Leipzig. Meanwhile, the Army of the North and the Army of Silesia would follow the same direction after crossing the Elbe River. Thus, Napoleon was on the verge of being enveloped by 3 enemy armies. The Army of Bohemia advanced slowly. By October 5th, it occupied Zwickau and Chemnitz. In Silesia, General Blücher skillfully masked his movement. Leaving 2 corps at Stolpen and Bischofwerder, he feigned attempts to cross at Meissen while rapidly moving his army to Wartenburg at the confluence of the Elster and Elbe rivers, where he crossed on October 3rd and 4th, despite opposition from the 7th Corps. On October 4th, the Army of the North, commanded by the Swedish Crown Prince, also crossed the Elbe at Roslau. Upon hearing this news, the Emperor departed Dresden on October 7th to confront Blücher, who was the closest to him. Napoleon hoped, with one of his signature manoeuvres, to catch the enemy armies mid-march and defeat them separately. Marshal Gouvion Saint-Cyr, with the 1st and 14th Corps, was left to defend Dresden, and thus found himself isolated from the rest of the army. Since the operations of the Grande Armée no longer concerned the 1st Corps, I will only summarize them briefly before resuming the story of the 1st Corps through the end of this unfortunate campaign. The King of Naples was given command of the troops facing the Army of Bohemia, composed of the 2nd, 5th, and 8th Corps and the 4th Cavalry. Napoleon, for his part, arrived on October 9th at Eilenburg on the Mulde River with the Imperial Guard and the 3rd, 4th, 6th, 7th, and 11th Corps. The Guard had suffered little, and despite the losses of various army corps, the total strength of this force was still difficult to estimate at less than 125,000 men. Blücher was at Düben, and the Swedish Crown Prince was at Dessau. The Emperor moved to engage them, intending to push them back across the right bank of the Elbe. However, contrary to his expectations, they retreated across the left bank of the Mulde and soon even beyond the Saale to Bernburg, Rothenburg, and Halle, leaving Berlin and all of Prussia exposed. It is said that Napoleon then conceived a bold countermarch. We have seen how resolutely he had defended the line of the Elbe, with his right at Dresden and his left at Magdeburg. His new plan was to maintain this same line, but reverse it, placing his left at Dresden and his right at Magdeburg, where vast supplies had been amassed. In this position, he could occupy Berlin and relieve the garrisons of the Oder fortresses, while linking up with the Prince of Eckmühl, who remained in Hamburg. However, the army was too physically and morally weakened to attempt such a daring operation without recklessness. The Allied armies would have been positioned between Napoleon's forces and the Rhine frontier. Under such circumstances, the interruption of communications with France would have been a grave matter. While the Emperor's skill might have achieved some partial victories over detached coalition forces, he would have eventually been overwhelmed by their numerical superiority. The consequences of such a bold maneuver might have been even more disastrous than those of the Battle of Leipzig. In any case, The defection of Bavaria rendered this plan impossible. Napoleon learned of this on October 14th at Dubin. It was no doubt that the Kingdom of Württemberg and the Grand Duchy of Baden would follow suit. Thus, France's frontiers were exposed from Huninge to Mainz, and it was certain that the combined Austrian and Bavarian armies would move to cut off Napoleon's retreat. In this dire situation, it became urgent to reach Leipzig, reopen communications with France, and avoid being entirely encircled. Napoleon concentrated his army at Leipzig on October 15th. That same day, the enemy forces came into contact. The French army was positioned around the city, and two bloody battles occurred on the 16th and 18th. A total of 130,000 French troops fought against 250,000 enemy soldiers. Skill and bravery eventually gave way to numerical superiority. The Saxons deserted on the battlefield, and the retreat began on the night of October 18th to 19th. The entire army was to cross the bridge over the Elster River, but through an incredible stroke of misfortune, a military engineer detonated the bridge before the rear guard could pass, trapping them in Leipzig. The French lost 30,000 men killed or wounded, 20,000 prisoners, and 150 cannons. The army retreated along the route through Weissenfels, Erfurt, Gotha, and Fulda, reaching Hanau, where the Austrian and Bavarian armies attempted to block their path. Despite its weakness and exhaustion, the French army found the strength to fight these former allies who had so unexpectedly become enemies. The French forces broke through, inflicting 6,000 casualties on the Austro-Bavarian forces, including killed and wounded, and taking 4,000 prisoners. French losses totaled about 5,000. This final effort marked the end of the Grande Armée's operations in Germany. The Emperor crossed the Rhine at Mainz on November 2nd, turning his focus solely to the defence of France. I now return to the story of the First Corps, abandoned in Dresden with the 14th. At the beginning of October, the 14th Corps was still stationed at Liebstadt, while the First Corps occupied the Gieshuebel camp, with the 1st Division at the vanguard in Hellendorf, approximately 24 kilometres from Dresden. On October 7th, as Napoleon prepared to depart, he ordered the two corps to fall back to positions at Pirna and Dohna, keeping the cavalry and rear guard as far forward as possible. If this movement had not been commanded, it would have become necessary 2 days later. In fact, it was not even possible to hold Pirna. General Benningsen had replaced the Austrian army in front of Dresden and began his operations with a general reconnaissance intended to push as far as the city walls. My brigade, left alone at Hellendorf, withdrew during the night to Pirna. The light cavalry followed this movement on the morning of October 8th, constantly harassed by the enemy's cavalry. On the morning of the 8th, 60 men from the 23rd Division were captured in a redoubt in front of Pirna. In the following days, we continued our retreat, constantly engaging the enemy vanguard. On the 10th, Count Lobau had his horse killed under him, an event for which he was at fault, as he had positioned himself on a high causeway near Grünewiese. Troops were in battle formation on both sides of the road, and the causeway became an easy target for enemy artillery. In the group of his staff, it was inevitable that someone would be hit. On the 11th, we returned to Dresden, as did the 14th Corps, which had conducted its retreat on the right flank. The 1st Corps was stationed in the Pirna suburb, with the 1st Division at the forefront in the Grossgarten area. The 14th Corps, now united with the 1st for the defence of Dresden, consisted of 4 divisions: the 42nd, commanded by Mouton Duvernet, the 43rd, Claparède, the 44th, Berthizen, and the 45th, Razout. As mentioned earlier, the 42nd Division often operated alongside us. Mouton Duvernet, an experienced and wise veteran, would later become a victim of political discord, executed in 1815 for siding with Napoleon during the 100 Days. Claparède, a brave soldier covered in wounds, was well liked and known for his camaraderie. Later he became a peer of France, governor of the Strasbourg Palace, and a permanent inspector general of the 1st Division troops. Berthizen later participated in the Algerian expedition in 1830. I have previously mentioned Razu during the Russian campaign. He had been an excellent infantry colonel. Unfortunately, his extremely poor eyesight prevented him from assessing battlefield conditions and forced him to rely entirely on those around him. The Imperial Army had an odd aversion to using binoculars or spectacles. Officers refused to admit they had poor eyesight. Only Marshal Davout was an exception to this rule. Among the brigade generals was Letellier, one of the younger generals in the army like myself. His brilliant bravery, peculiar and touchy nature, and eccentric conduct were well known. Later, domestic troubles strained his already sensitive mind, and during the Restoration, he tragically ended his life in suicide. Marshal Saint-Cyr's military talents are too well known to require praise here. However, I will note two significant flaws. His reluctance to support other generals in critical moments, as seen at the Battle of Kulm, and his tendency to approach war like a chess game, completely disregarding the morale of the troops, a crucial factor, especially when leading French soldiers. Throughout this campaign, we never saw him. He neither rode on horseback nor appeared before the troops, nor did he receive visitors. Orders were issued and executed. That was all he required. To us, he was known only by his signature. Count Lobau was quite different. While not particularly affable, his demeanour was brusque and his exterior rough. He was always visible on horseback, leading the troops. He was passionate, slightly irritable, but possessed a keen mind and firm character. Such contrasting generals were unlikely to work harmoniously together. The combined 1st and 14th Corps numbered around 25,000 men at this time. In Dresden, there were 30 generals, numerous administrators, and stores of all kinds. Marshal Gouvion Saint-Cyr was criticized for not abandoning Dresden when the coalition armies advanced on Leipzig. It was suggested that he could have executed a diversionary maneuver behind enemy lines or descended the Elbe toward Torgau. To assess this decision, one must consider the orders he received from Napoleon. Upon leaving Dresden on October 7th, Napoleon foresaw the possibility of evacuating the city. He issued the following directive. Marshal Saint-Cyr will send all loaded boats carrying the wounded to Torgau on the night of October 7th and during the day of the 8th. He must be ready during the night of October 8th to 9th to evacuate Dresden if necessary, after destroying the blockhouses, burning all artillery carriages used for the city's defence, spiking the guns, burning all remaining caissons and wagons, and distributing all clothing supplies to the troops, leaving behind only 5,000 to 6,000 invalids too weak to be transported. It will be necessary for the two divisions remaining in Dresden on the 7th to occupy Meissen and Nossen in force. Marshal Saint-Cyr will hold Sonnenstein until the last moment. The bridge at Meissen should remain intact until the rearguard has crossed it, as it may still prove useful. However, on October 10th at Düben, when Napoleon hoped to defeat the Silesian and Berlin armies separately, the Chief of Staff wrote to Marshal Saint-Cyr, "The Emperor expects that, in any case, you will hold Dresden. If, however, due to unforeseen events, you cannot maintain the city, which the Emperor hopes will not occur, you may withdraw to Torgau by either bank of the river. If a battle takes place here and the enemy is defeated, the Austrians will retreat into their borders, and the Emperor will move closer to Torgau via the right bank to establish communication with you. Conversely, if no battle occurs, it is possible the Emperor may operate on the right bank of the Elbe to strike at the enemy's line of operations. In sum, the events of today and tomorrow remain incalculable. The Emperor relies on your firmness and prudence." Finally, on October 14th, near Leipzig, Napoleon wrote once more that everything would be decided on the 15th and 16th, and that they could expect to be relieved quickly. Thus it was clearly the Emperor's intention to defend Dresden as much as possible. He had only outlined the direction to take if abandoning the city became unavoidable. It is true that on October 23rd, after the Battle of Leipzig, the Emperor sent disguised agents from Erfurt to Marshal Saint-Cyr and Marshal Davout in Hamburg, carrying instructions stating, "Marshals Saint-Cyr and Davout and the garrisons of the strongholds must break through on one side or the other. If they coordinate and leave their fortifications, they will be saved. 80,000 French troops can push through anywhere." However, none of these letters reached their recipients. Thus, Marshal Saint-Cyr's duty was to remain in Dresden and defend it. Nevertheless, it was not a matter of confining the troops within the city. Dresden's fortifications were not defensible. The city was a pentagon without outer works, and at that time in poor condition. On the right bank of the Elbe, the Neustadt suburb was encircled by a simple fieldwork. Moreover, to defend the city's core, the suburbs would have had to be destroyed, and Napoleon could not bring himself to treat the capital of an allied king, the only one who had remained loyal, with such severity. Had Dresden been like a typical fortress, the emperor would have left only a garrison there, as he did in Torgau and Wittenberg. The second and only viable strategy was to defend the entrenched camp outside Dresden. This consisted of a series of redoubts on both banks of the Elbe, skillfully constructed and recently repaired. Our 25,000 troops were not excessive for such a task. The First Corps was stationed on the left bank of the Elbe, with its left flank anchored on the river, and its right on the road to Dieppe-Diswolle. The divisions of the 14th Corps defended the remainder of the perimeter, including the Neustadt suburb on the right bank. Divisions of the First Corps rotated through posts in the Grossgarten, a rectangular park outside the Pirna Gate that had been fortified and integrated into the redoubt system. We also manned the redoubts, while the remainder of the divisions were quartered in the Pirna suburb. General Benningsen had left General Tolstoy with 2,000 of his weaker troops in front of Dresden, while he continued marching toward Leipzig. After a few days, Marshal Saint-Cyr deemed the moment ripe for a sortie. The enemy was sparse and forced to maintain a long perimeter around the city. A shortage of provisions was imminent, and the sortie aimed to address this. Additionally, the enemy was building redoubts near Ragnitz, which needed to be destroyed. The sortie was announced 3 days in advance, and the meticulous planning and precision characteristic of Marshal Gouvion Saint-Cyr's orders were evident. I awaited the outcome with both impatience and unease. Success meant more than supplies. It would restore the honour of our arms, grant us vengeance, and uplift our morale. I gathered the senior officers of my brigade, who alone were privy to the plan, and emphasized the importance of seizing what might be our final opportunity to end the campaign with glory. They pledged their utmost efforts, and they kept their word. At precisely noon on the 17th, Division Razout advanced on Plauen, Division Claparède on Ragnitz, and Divisions Cassagne and Dumonceau, 1st and 2nd, on Schörnitz. The attack was fierce and successful. Enemy skirmishers attempted to defend Schörnitz, but the village was set ablaze to drive them out. The Russians could not withstand the force and cohesion of our 3 assaults. They were routed, retreating to Dohna, and leaving behind 1,200 prisoners, 10 cannons, caissons, and a bridge train. Battalion Commander Loqueneux of the 17th led the skirmishers brilliantly, inspiring them with his courage and significantly contributing to the day's success. The officers of the 17th supported him well, with 2 wounded and several deserving recognition for the Legion of Honor. I had to use my authority to keep Colonel Susbiel from joining the skirmishers like a light infantry corporal instead of remaining with his regiment. General Tolstoy withdrew toward Gischubel. Our 2nd Division, acting as the vanguard, occupied Dohna. The 1st held Sporwitz and Lochwitz, while Duvernay's division positioned itself to our right. The 4 days spent in this position were used effectively. We gathered livestock, flour, and fodder from a 16-kilometre radius between the Elbe and the Weißeritz, destroyed enemy works, and took every possible measure to extend the city's defence. Soon, General Chasteler, stationed at Töplitz to defend Bohemia, joined forces with General Tolstoy, and they resumed the offensive. On the 22nd, General Dumonceau was attacked at Dohna and withdrew to Lochwitz. The two divisions then took positions on the heights behind the village. On the 24th, we continued our retreat to Racknitz, Schernitz and Strehlen. By the 26th, we had returned to Dresden's suburbs, leaving some battalions ahead, which the enemy pushed back on the 28th. The October 17th sortie was entirely successful. It had been a general foraging operation that the enemy could not prevent. We then confined ourselves to holding the suburbs and the redoubts, guarding their approaches. Life in Dresden was sombre. The situation of a besieged city and the accompanying widespread misery discouraged social gatherings and pleasures. Although interactions with some city residents might have offered relief, I avoided such distractions. The defence of the suburbs and their outlying redoubts was our responsibility. While a full-scale assault seemed unlikely, vigilance remained essential. Too often, our troops had demonstrated their need for supervision. Defeat in war is acceptable, but being caught unprepared is not. Personally, I was determined to conclude the mission entrusted to us with honour, even though its grim resolution seemed inevitable. At this time, an important debate arose within the Defence Council, composed of divisional generals and the General Intendant, convening at Marshal Saint-Cyr's quarters. The outcome of the Battle of Leipzig was known. The Grande Armée was retreating beyond the Rhine, and we had been abandoned. Austrian General Klenau had arrived before Dresden to take command of the blockading forces. He openly declared his intent not to attack, relying on the impending depletion of provisions to compel our surrender. Before reaching that point, however, was there nothing we could attempt? Napoleon's instructions had been to hold Dresden as long as possible and await relief. But now, with the Grand Army gone from Germany, there was no hope of rescue. The only way to preserve the Dresden garrison for France was to attempt to break out toward Torgau along one of the Elbe's banks. It was clear that prolonging the defence was futile. The choice lay between a sortie and capitulation. Opinions were divided. Count Lobau and General Cassagny strongly advocated for a sortie, believing it could succeed. The besieging army was spread thin, forming a large circle around the city. We had nearly 25,000 troops and significant artillery. Concentrating our forces along the road to Torgau offered a reasonable chance of breaking through the enemy lines and reaching Torgau, only 72 kilometres away. Moreover, such an effort was more honourable and worthy of the French army. This would likely have been my personal stance, had my rank entitled me to join the council. Marshal Gouvion Saint-Cyr thought quite differently. He saw no hope of success. Indeed, the enemy army was scattered around Dresden, but General Klenau knew very well that any sortie we might attempt would have to be directed along the Elbe. It was precisely in that area where he had concentrated his main forces. Furthermore, the combined strength of the two corps did not approach the 25,000 combatants claimed. The weakened state of our soldiers and their long-standing discouragement made such a bold attempt impractical. To Marshal Saint-Cyr, as I have mentioned before, war was merely a game of chess. The match had been lost at Leipzig, and he saw no point in unnecessarily endangering soldiers, numerous officer cadres, and 30 generals whose services might still prove useful in the future. The discussions on this matter were intense and repeated, particularly between the Marshal and Count Lobau. Prudence seldom aligns with reckless valour. One side is accused of irrationality, the other of weakness. When military honour is at stake, sensitivities are understandably heightened. Time, however, was running out. By early November, we were on the brink of running out of provisions. A decision had to be made. Marshal Saint-Cyr settled on a curious compromise between the two opposing views in the council. The 3 divisions of the First Corps, along with the divisions of Razout and Duvernay under Count Lobau, would leave Dresden, while he himself would remain in the city with the divisions of Berthizen and Claparède. This was not at all what we had envisioned. We wanted everyone to leave together, with the Marshal leading us, sharing in our fortunes, whether good or bad. Only a few days earlier, he had judged us too weak to break through the enemy lines. Did he now believe success more likely with 2 fewer divisions? I understand Marshal Saint-Cyr's reasoning. He might have said, "Count Lobau strongly insisted on leaving Dresden. I did not wish to oppose him. I gave him all the troops I could spare. But since I did not agree with the plan, I remained in the city and, reduced to 2 divisions, I was ultimately forced to capitulate." In this way, we would have been sacrificed to explain and justify a capitulation we did not support. That would have been neither fair nor reasonable. We should either leave together or capitulate together. There was no other option. As such, we undertook this expedition reluctantly, but there was no choice but to obey. On November 6th, before dawn, the 5 divisions left the Neustadt suburb via the road to Grossenhain. The 1st Division led the march, with General Cassagna commanding the 1st Brigade and myself leading the 2nd. The enemy vanguard resisted, and our soldiers hesitated. We drove them forward with a bayonet charge under a hail of bullets. The enemy was overrun, and a fierce exchange of gunfire broke out in the woods that the road traverses. We reached the base of the Drachenberg, ahead of the village of Boxdorf, and found the division of Prince Wiedrünkel fully occupying the heights. Count Lobau assessed the position and determined that taking it would entail enormous losses. Even assuming success, we would be too weakened to hope to reach Torgau. Count Lobau consulted the general officers and, based on our unanimous advice, he decided to wait for nightfall and return to Dresden. We lost nearly 1,000 men killed or wounded in total. The 36th Regiment suffered 2 officers killed and 1 wounded. That marked our final effort, the ultimate tribute to the honor of our arms. Without provisions, continuing resistance any longer would have been an unnecessary sacrifice of lives and would have subjected an Allied city to famine and the dangers of a direct assault. Capitulation was our only option, and necessity made it our duty. That concludes the 22nd part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.